The Tropical Climate of Minneapolis-St. Paul by Howard W. Robertson. Quote, "Local is global," end quote. Sir Crispin Tickle. The moon viewing platform is how Hope and I refer to the window seat in our hotel room on the 21st floor of the Minneapolis Hilton, where I sit on October 7th, 2006, at 4:30 a.m., observing the moonlight through the Higgs particles that give its electrons mass and slow them down to less than light speed, and the full lunar orb above the downtown while my wife snores delicately behind me on the cozy queen-size bed after her first big, busy day at the major international landscape architecture conference over the nice skywalk and across the street in the massive convention center. And I ponder the revenge of Gaia while Minnesota enjoys the last balmy bit of unseasonably warm weather and awaits the Arctic incursion that will bring the shivering drop into wintry temperatures, and even possibly some snow, the weather woman said on the local TV news last night. Quietly repeating to myself for some odd reason a panpsychic phrase from Minnesota geology. The yellow blebs of chalcopyrite and the copper-nickel ore, followed by this haunted Russian clause from childhood. Luna сияет над землей. The moon shines over the earth. Noticing the way the city lights have made the stars invisible so that the murky but cloudless night suggests the primal background radiation on the pluriversal margins from the beginning of time itself, some 15 billion years ago, when an original equilibrium state of thermodynamic chaos predominated in which every atom moved randomly with the same average energy as every other. And imagining how the cosmos then balled its ubiquitous hydrogen together into densities great enough to fuse into helium and in the process burn as stars. How this emergent, self-organizing, non-equilibrium system miraculously established itself athwart the entropy as an inconceivably vast universal complexity of galaxies, suns, planets, and interstellar gas and dust, all based upon those incomprehensibly tiny subatomic particles working within mysteriously set parameters that enabled the star factories to exist and the stellar foundries to forge out of hydrogen every other atom. The basic participatory beings in whom matter and psyche were indissoluble. The carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, sulfur, calcium, iron, silicon units, and their ilk without which Plato could not have existed, to realize the cosmos was a single animistic entity supplied with such intelligence and containing all other entities. Nor Aristotle have materialized to become aware of those dual cryptic forces of attraction and repulsion governing these ineluctable interiorities at the very heart of matter energy, these positive and negative charges inexplicably providing the soul and foundation for physical reality. Nor could this assemblage of 60% hydrogen and 40% other elements that calls itself me have collected at this nocturnal intersection of manifold scales of temporal spatial phenomena in the epistemological experience of being human at a relative center of these smithereens into which that primordial cosmogenic explosion blew itself, and whence I now so spherically project from my hara my ardent desire for a spiritually honest communion with the eternal key of the entire creation. How while the universe was beholding itself for around 10.4 billion years and renewing itself against all thermodynamic odds, And while the carbon stardust in those shining spiral arms of our galaxy kept expanses in space-time cold enough for self-propagating star formation to happen often, an interior rustling of the cosmos, condensed according to the fine-tuned parameter for weak nuclear attraction, into another supernova flaring forth 4.6 billion years ago as the nebula of sidereal matter that became our own solar system with our oikos, our dear home, our Earth, which after 100 million years was struck by that Mars-sized chunk of interplanetary debris to knock off an orbiting companion, our affecting moon ever since. The way the Montevideo gneiss in western Minnesota roughly coincides at 3.6 billion years old with that distant beginning of the age of the anaerobes, the Archean eon with those pink skies and brown seas due to an absence of O2 and an abundance of methane. That Edenic time when a microbial sentience spread over our Earth, and when Gaia emerged, this nascent biosphere that included the entire surface of the primeval globe, the whole wondrous thing, the atmosphere, the oceans and rivers, the rocks with the bacterial life forms that transformed it all suddenly into a self-regulating superorganism in defiance of entropy and akin to the galaxies, a terrestrial physiology catalyzed by the myriad species of the burgeoning bacteria with their social lives and group identity, their collective memory, their common knowledge, their capacity for transferring genetic innovations laterally across species boundaries, their collective decision-making that invented techniques for extracting and storing energy, for capturing essential nutrients such as nitrogen to build genes and proteins, and such as phosphorus for ATP molecules, and for originally breathing nitrates, sulfur, iron, and such before pioneering a capacity for photosynthesis about 3 billion years ago, which enabled them to use the sun's potency to power the taking of carbon from CO2 and the exhaling of oxygen, so that a 500 million years later these high-powered aerobic microbes arose in the newly oxygenated atmosphere and oceans, and became nucleated for the very first time as the Proterozoic eon began, during which the old prokaryotic cyanophytes and bacteria developed over a couple billion years into eukaryotic marine plants and invertebrates, the transformative stromatolites and the algal kindred having driven the microbial anaerobic methanogens and their kind down into the airless bottom mud of ponds and oceans, the upper atmospheric ozone layer having come into being to protect all the new aerobic species not so resistant to the intense ultraviolet radiation as the blue-green algae had been for so unbelievably long. The skies and seas having changed to the cerulean and aqua blues so familiar and so beautiful to us now, and the structure of new cells having become more complex through endosymbioses, in which the mitochondria of all creatures evolved from bacterial oxygen-breathing forebears in their ancient cooperative association with the host cells, and in which likewise the chloroplasts and plants were formed from photosynthetic bacterial ancestors, and having continued meanwhile the cellular autopoiesis of the bacteria as they reenacted the constant composition of their own interiors, and kept the planet always alive by sequestering energy, by recycling basic elements of the biosphere, and by decomposing them within a tightly coupled metabolic network spanning the entire globe, and so preserving the optimal conditions for life in the external as well as the internal environments. A happenstance as unlikely as surviving a drive blindfolded through rush hour traffic, and as inspiring as the Bhagavad Gita, where it told us whoever sensed the universal soul in all things was never lost. An apothegm I now apply to our inescapable embeddedness in Gaia, to the animate qualities within each speck of matter, and to the more than 99.9% of fecund emptiness inside every atom in the cosmos. The way the bedrock beneath this hotel was already here during the Proterozoic, while iron and silica were being precipitated as oxides by microorganisms in warm, shallow waters around these parts way back when, to accumulate so gradually over hundreds of millions of years into the iron formations and quartz of Minnesota. While the biggest of all the very many terrestrial glaciations was occurring here too, during which the whole Earth iced over 2,500 feet thick for 10 million years, including all the oceans, so that scientists now call it Snowball Earth, and so that I hear Job's query here in the modern moonbeams, out of whose womb came the ice. While the towering Precambrian mountains rose up above the Minnesota landscape for a second time, and then were weathered away once again for better than 1 billion years into this current peneplain of Minneapolis-St. Paul, and while a lifetime burned during every moment in the old decipherable stones, the way not even 600 million years ago, the Phanerozoic era exploded into great colonies of cells that evolved into ever more complicated life forms, and that culminated, despite 5 major and many minor extinctions, in fabulous biodiversity, commencing in the oceans, and including some of us vertebrates at last. An emergence of new patterns of order and living systems at those spontaneous moments when the entities of Earth pressed toward being with such becoming fullness, such presence of love, that there was nothing in range of their generous rapture that did not come to life, until after 200 million more years the plants invaded dry land, formed symbioses with fungi while Minnesota was still located along the equator, and spread out across the continents in the vanguard, leading the herbivores and then carnivores onto the bare rock, weathering it and adding dead organic material to build up soil and eventually oil and coal too, engendering the fierce green fire in a predator's eye, the intricate activity of web-spinning spiders seen in a trance underground in a heavy rain, or the grassland emanating benevolence, boundlessness, and vitality to a child who went on to live out on the prairie the rest of his life, and initiating the calcium and silica cycles to cool the earth while making chalk and shells, and the dimethyl sulfide cycle of the peat bogs for seeding the brain. And how we humans who came into existence only during these last 150,000 years of an ice age, 2.5 million years long, with brutal seesawing weather that prevented our progress to farming and hence to civilization until 10,000 years ago, when it warmed up a wee bit. We who these days continue to burn our petajoules of gasoline and other fossil fuels so that greenhouse gases are warming the globe, and so the ice sheet that retreated northward from Minnesota 12,000 years ago is now on the verge of disappearing altogether as a couple sphere droops of fresh water into the northern oceans that will raise sea levels all over the earth and flood all the coasts of all our continents and islands. We whose thermal impact has inspired the prophetic Lovelock to predict the demise of the world political order within 100 years and a return to rule by petty tyrants in a catastrophically overheated environment, and has made me now dream of the breakdown of all civility here beside the fossiliferous limestones of Minnehaha Falls, of Minnesotans actually being rude to us, of Lutherans becoming barbaric, of the warlords of Minneapolis-St. Paul running amok, and of Garrison Keillor rampaging in a berserker gear. We whose pollution, population explosion, overharvesting, habitat destruction, and unintentional introduction of invasive species is causing Gaia to hemorrhage genomes at 1,000 times the normal rate of extinction, so that sticking with business as usual will in all likelihood result in 3 of every 5 species not surviving into the next century. And we too, who dream up here tonight in the high moonlight, we, or just I, so fondly fantasize about crocodiles sunning themselves along the upper Mississippi River, over by the historic flour mills after the tropical weather conditions of 70 million years ago have returned. About primitive sharks swimming down Hiawatha Avenue after the inland seas have advanced again as 100 million years ago. About tree ferns and horsetails near 90 feet tall, such as grew here 300 million years ago in the Carboniferous period. About cephalopods 2 yards long, as were found fossilized here in the Platteville Formation from 450 million years ago. About the temperature soaring 20 degrees Fahrenheit and staying so for 200,000 years, as happened here 55 million years ago at the start of the Eocene epoch, due to a geological release of a couple teratons of carbon into the air. And about my optimistic wife, Hope, arising refreshed out of bed at dawn pretty soon, and going over the skywalk to many sessions on green roof design, sustainable building sites, permeable pavements, stormwater management, constructed wetlands, and ecological restoration, doing her loving best to prevent the Earth from reaching a climactic tipping point, at which the climate suddenly reconfigures itself into a new steady state that has no place for humans, though the microbes will go on just fine without us for the next billion years, until the sun grows so hot even they must perish together with Gaia, with the incarnate dimension of living landscape in which all creatures big and tiny are embedded, the interpenetrating and massive webwork of perceptions and sensations borne by countless bodies, such as the icy streams tumbling down granitic slopes, as owl wings at midnight, as lichens on tree trunks, as the unseen and implacable wind, and generally as a natural covenant, as reciprocal alliances among divergent components of this common flesh of our divine biosphere.